Our guest tonight, I actually owe a debt of gratitude to one of our very first speakers. If you remember, back when we started doing this, a gentleman named Clay Risen came and mentioned about a friend of his that worked not too far from here over at Brown University, and I was teaching at the City College of New York. Somebody named Ted Widmer, and he was working on a book about Abraham Lincoln and his trek to Washington D.C. On his way to become the president. And as someone who was born and bred in Illinois, and we probably have Land of Lincoln on our license plate, this was music that was manna from heaven for me. So Ted Widmer has worked for, and you can I'll let you explain, but you've worked for both Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, as well as being a professor. So would you welcome Ted Widmer?
Thank you, Mark. Great to be here. I'm flattered Clay said that. Clay is a good friend and a great historian in his own right, and he's just been promoted. He's supervising the New York Times coverage of the campaign of 2020, which is not only an important assignment, a very hard assignment, because we just heard today there won't even really be a Democratic convention, so Clay has to figure all that out. And he does amazing journalistic work, but then he's never too busy to think about history, and he's been a good friend to me as I've tried to write history books, and he's friends to a lot of other people out there, so happy to have the recommendation. You guys have such a good series. I want to see every talk coming up, including Dynasty, the New England Patriots one, and I'm half tempted to just start talking about the New England Patriots for a while if no one objects. But I think you want me to talk about Lincoln, so I will. I began this project writing a series of daily newspaper articles for Clay Risen, who was just mentioned. He was an editor at the New York Times, and the New York Times in 2011, 9 years ago, was trying to deepen its history writing and trying to also figure out what it did with its online pages. And it started a project called Disunion, trying to tell the story of what happened 150 years ago every day on the same date in 1860, 61, and then all the way to 1865. And in the middle of that project, which I was very involved in, I began to want to just be a kind of detective following Lincoln. Lincoln is so incredibly interesting and so famous. And I thought it would be fun to follow him day to day. And I had read a lot of biographies of Lincoln. I thought I knew him pretty well. It was really interesting to drop down deep and become more like a detective, less like a historian. So I found this project, which was the story of his train ride from Springfield to Washington in February 1861. It's a train trip that lasts 13 days. And I thought that would be a fun thing to cover for 13 days in a row in the online New York Times. And then the more I did it, the more I fell in love with the topic. It was incredibly interesting for lots of reasons. Lincoln is growing a lot in these 13 days. He's getting on a train, and I like trains, so that was a bonus for me. He's going to all these amazing American cities, each of which has a very strong personality of its own. Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Columbus, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Albany, New York, Trenton, Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Baltimore. They're all really exciting cities in 1861. And for me, that was a big part of the draw of this topic, was doing a kind of travelogue. It's not just about Lincoln, it's about looking at America. It's about looking out of the windows of the train as well as in the windows at Lincoln. And then there's this remarkable assassination conspiracy that nearly took Lincoln's life before he became president. So we all know the tragic way in which his life ended and his presidency ended. But I did not know the extent to which his life was in danger throughout the 13-day train trip to Washington, and how narrowly he avoided being murdered on the way in. And if he had been killed in Baltimore, most likely, this American history would have been completely different. We might not have even fought a civil war because we might have had no capacity to fight a civil war. The South might have been that much more established and impossible to attack. And another fear that I discovered in my research is that it was a very close call that Washington, D.C. stayed in the country, that Washington was more pro-slavery than anti-slavery, and Washington was agitating in its own way to be the capital of the southern version of the United States and not the northern version. So if Lincoln is killed on the way into Washington, there's no telling what would have happened, but our history would have been very, very different. And his survival was crucial, not only to the winning of the Civil War, but to the survival of the idea of the United States as a country dedicated to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, as he so beautifully put it in the Gettysburg Address, that this is a country that stands for freedom, stands for government of the people. And it couldn't be that and be a society dependent on slavery at the same time. It had to be one or the other. And so Lincoln, although always conciliatory, is forcing this decision on Americans and saying it really has to be one or the other. And because of him, we did become one or the other. We became a free country. We have our imperfections, as everyone knows, but we stood for the Declaration of Independence. We decided that we were going to stand up and defend our belief in human rights and equality, and all of the rights that are bundled together not only in the Declaration of Independence, but in the Bill of Rights and in many parts of the Constitution. So Lincoln's survival on a train trip was exciting for its own reasons, and I appreciated, as a historian, I had never really written a book that was a kind of adventure. This book is the first one I ever did that had a feeling of an adventure to it. But I also am just grateful to Abraham Lincoln for surviving so many threats. He had threats from his enemies, but he also had threats from his friends. The country wasn't really well set up to handle huge crowds greeting a president-elect in a train station. These were the biggest crowds that had ever gathered to that point. And sometimes Lincoln was in danger of being crushed to death by crowds trying to welcome him. In Buffalo, he had a very narrow escape from a crowd that liked him. And then there were all these dangers from people who didn't like him. So even though I had read a lot of Lincoln books and I thought I knew the story, by really dropping down very deep and reading a lot of newspapers from every city, I found this story within the story. And I'm so grateful that I did. As historians, we can start a project and we're not sure it's going to stay good all the way to the end. And this one not only stayed good, it kept getting better. And by the end, I was amazed at the grip it had on me. I had found a really good story, and I tried to do my duty by it. I tried to honor the strength of the story, and I honestly tried to keep myself out of it. I don't think I'm in it too much, but I tried to be a honorable witness to all the things I read about and the great heroism of Abraham Lincoln in constantly going out and speaking, even when he was sick, when his hands were sore from shaking thousands of people's hands. He went out and did it again. And this is a story of a hero who saved his country. And in history departments it's unpopular to use language like that. The mood of the country is very complicated at the moment, and heroes are a little bit out of fashion. But I picked this topic 9 years ago. I didn't know what the mood of the country would be in 2020, and I just stayed true to it. I tried to honor the integrity of the project, and my friends have been complimentary, but I'm very moved also that I've been getting a lot of emails from strangers who read the book and liked it and appreciated it. And I think there is something to the feeling of reading about Lincoln's struggles in 2020, because we are so divided as a nation. And to read about this man giving everything he's got to try to bring us together at another very divided moment is inspiring. And it shows a path that we might maybe be able to find in the years ahead. I don't know that we have an Abraham Lincoln coming. I think we probably don't. You know, that doesn't happen very often, but we might all learn from his example and treat each other a little more decently and remember the ideals this country was founded upon, and just get out of our echo chambers a little bit and think about the United States of America as one country and not two different angry camps. So none of that was on my radar when I started the book, but with the book finished, it come up a lot in question and answer sessions. So I'm trying to be open to that as well.
Okay. As you know, when we do these things, we've got questions. If you go down the bottom of your screen, you can see the chat feature. So we got questions. So you mentioned about he runs into issues on the train in Baltimore. Tell us about that. What happens there?
So as he's getting closer and closer to his destination, Washington, he's getting more and more intelligence that a lot of people want to kill him. And he at first tries to ignore it. He doesn't want to be worried about it, and he thinks everything's going to be okay. But then the warnings are coming in, and they're serious. And one thing I'm proud of in this book is I found two really remarkable women who told, they were part of the discovery of the plot to kill Lincoln. And without these two women, I think he probably would have been killed. So there's a woman named Dorothea Dix, who's born in Maine but grows up in Massachusetts. And she is a mental health advocate, and she's popular in the South as well as the North. She's got a lot of friends in every state because she's been helping every state deal with mental health problems. And she's on a trip through the South in the fall of 1860 when Lincoln he wins the election. And while traveling, I think she was in South Carolina when she heard this. She hears about this extremely detailed plan to kill Lincoln when he comes through on the train in Baltimore. And what they were going to do, Baltimore had 3 train stations, and you had to get off and transfer on a horse and buggy to the next station. And when Lincoln did that, they were going to surround him with as many as 1,000 men and shoot at him and set off explosive devices and stab him if necessary. And he wouldn't have had a chance. The Baltimore police were probably in on the plot in some way. They were going to agree to not police that street on that day, according to intelligence gathered later. So this brave woman from Massachusetts hears all this, and she goes to the head of the railroad. She was a remarkable woman, and instead of complaining or telling the wrong people, she goes to exactly the right person. Another guy from Massachusetts named Samuel Felton, who is the head of this railroad from Philadelphia to Baltimore and Washington. And he listens and he decides it's a serious thing. It's interesting. It's like two people from Massachusetts, neither of whom live in Massachusetts anymore, but I think they had an understanding. And he decides it's a real threat, and he hires the best railroad detective he knows, Alan Pinkerton, who's a Scottish immigrant living in Chicago, brings Pinkerton out to Baltimore, and Pinkerton brings 8 operatives with him. One is this remarkable woman named Kate Warney, who's a 28-year-old widow, and she just melts into the crowds in Baltimore and meets people and figures out everything about the plot within very short time. So a second woman the first woman has discovered the plot. A second woman is a spy, basically figures out everything among the people who are in the middle of the plot. It's very, very dangerous for her to be there. But she figures it all out and tells Pinkerton, and Pinkerton sends her to warn Lincoln's delegation as the train is coming through all these northern cities, but they're beginning to get ready to come south. Kate Warney is sent north. She rides a train all night to say, you can't go through Baltimore, it's too dangerous. So they devise a plan. Lincoln doesn't want to do it, but he finally agrees to do it. They devise a plan that he will go through Baltimore in an ordinary train in the middle of the night, the last train of the night, with only 3 people around him, one of whom is Kate Warney, the woman I was just describing. So it's like the stuff of thriller movies. Lincoln very bravely goes into an ordinary passenger car, and he's become the most famous man in America, and goes through Baltimore at 3:30 in the morning, and nobody knows he's on the train, and he makes it. And the next day he arrives at dawn at Washington and walks out, and nobody knows it's him. And he goes to a hotel and checks in, and the city goes crazy. And like, how did he get here? Because the prevailing wisdom was that he was going to be shot. So Lincoln survived a very elaborate assassination attempt before the one that did kill him at the end of the war. And you know, that was tragic. But the fact that he survived this earlier one meant that American history could continue the way it was supposed to continue.
Segueing from there, you mentioned about, that he almost died in Buffalo by people who liked him, but you also then said threats by people who did not like him. Besides what happened in Baltimore, what other threats, what other places was he at risk?
Well, on the first day of the journey, the train is barreling along, and there was a pilot engine in front of his train. And near the Indiana-Illinois border, they found this impediment had been put on the tracks to throw a train off the tracks. And because the pilot train was going first, they caught it and they removed it. So that was, maybe an attempt, maybe not. It's a little hard to know, but it was a serious obstacle on the tracks. Then in Cincinnati, just before he got on the train, someone saw a bag in the car he was supposed to go on and looked in, and there was an explosive device. So someone had planted a bomb on his train just before he was about to get on, and they removed it. So that one, he was okay too, but he was constantly in danger throughout the entire trip, and the trip is through northern states.
Was he cognizant of all these? I mean, did he know that this was happening?
I believe so. In his correspondence, there are a lot of letters coming into him saying, don't go through Baltimore. They really hate you in Baltimore. And he was getting hate mail too. He was getting drawings of him with a noose around his neck, or I include in the book a very vulgar letter sent to him with a lot of swear words about how they were going to kill him. And so how could he not be aware? But he was also resigned to do his duty. He was a large man physically, and I don't think he could be easily intimidated physically. but also he just believed that at this moment in American history, the people needed a president who was out there with them. And part of the problem, there'd been a few presidents in a row who no one ever saw. They were sort of hidden in the White House. They were Northerners, but controlled by the South. And it's kind of a depressing combination, not really loved by anybody. James Buchanan is the president right before Lincoln. He's from Pennsylvania. And he didn't leave the White House too much and just, didn't have any rapport with the people. And so Lincoln, I think, instinctively, and in a lot of this was instinct. It wasn't a written out plan, but Lincoln had an instinct that if he could be with the people, things would be okay. So he just met tens of thousands of people at every stop, incredible numbers, and shook hands with as many as he could. And it was almost like he was campaigning for the office, even though he had already won the office, but he sensed that he needed to campaign to deserve the office. And back then people didn't campaign, they just stayed at home. And I think he had a strong sense that he needed to reach the American people because something really big was about to happen and they needed to be together. And as it turned out, that was true.
What was the actual route, city by city? And was it advertised? Did everybody know he was going to stop here and stop there?
Yes, it was advertised, which of course increased the danger. But it was a very winding route. He starts in his hometown, Springfield, gives a beautiful farewell address to Springfield, then to Indianapolis, not too far, first day, then to Cincinnati the day after that, then to Columbus the day after that, then to Pittsburgh, then from Pittsburgh to Cleveland, Cleveland to Buffalo, Buffalo across upstate New York to Albany, Albany down the Hudson to New York City, where he stayed 2 days, New York to, he went to Trenton, but he made it to Philadelphia the same night. And the next day, Philadelphia to Harrisburg, and then that was the all-nighter. That was the night he secretly got on a train back to Philadelphia, boarded the last train from Philadelphia to Baltimore to Washington. And then he arrives on February 23rd, 1861 at dawn in Washington.
Okay, you also mentioned too that it's interesting about Washington that, that the citizens of Washington were debating about whether to be in the Confederacy or be in the Union. Let's play the what if game. If they wanted to be in the Confederacy, and here comes the president-elect or the new, how's this going to work?
That was the question. How is this going to work? And one feeling I had in my research was that we sort of grow up thinking Washington, D.C. is a great capital and has all these pretty buildings, and it's fun to go there with a school group, but it wasn't a great capital. It wasn't a great location for the capital of a country founded on equality and democracy. It's deep in the South. It's not slightly in the South, it's deep in the South. So the Mason-Dixon line is between Pennsylvania and Maryland. So Maryland is a slave state. Then you get to Washington, and then Virginia also surrounds it. It's a slave state. So it is deep in slave territory, and it has slavery inside the district. And there are mainly Southerners who live there. Marylanders are Southerners and Virginians are Southerners, but there are also a lot of people from Carolinas and Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi who all live there. They like it. And so it's just part of the way slavery was baked into our society, was that our capital was very pro-slavery. There were free people of color and slaves. There were both kinds of African Americans living there. And there were Northerners and Southerners living there, but overwhelmingly, the strength was with the Southerners who controlled the city's rules and controlled the federal government. And almost all presidents had been from the South. Senate committees, then as now, were controlled by Southerners. The officers of the US government, the people who sort of made it work, the messengers and the sergeants at arms of the Congress and the doorkeepers of the Capitol were all Southerners, and most of the Supreme Court justices were Southerners. So it's just really a Southern town. And after Lincoln wins, a lot of people say we don't want to be part of this version of the United States that's run by this uncouth Westerner. I mean, they're mad that a Northerner is won. They're also mad that an uncouth person, which is how a lot of people were describing Lincoln, because he had a very poor education. But deep down, I think a lot of it was just about slavery. It was about the grease that had greased the wheels for so long was going to stop. Lincoln was not going to allow slavery to expand, although he was going to allow it to stay where it already existed. So militias with guns start walking around the sidewalks of Washington saying, you know, we're not going to be a part of this government. And it was a really touchy time. And there were a lot of rumors described in letters that I read or diary entries about how a pretty small militia of 200 men was planning to come in and take over the US Capitol and take over all the documents inside the Capitol, including the Constitution of the United States, and make it available to the new country being formed in Montgomery, Alabama. You know, and things changed week to week. No one quite knew where it was going to be, where the headquarters would be, but there was a decent chance Washington, D.C. would become the capital of the southern version of the United States of America. And they might have even kept the name the United States of America, in which case Lincoln would have had to stop short somewhere like Philadelphia and maybe think of a new name for his country, even though he too was trying to keep the idea of the United States going. So everything was really up in the air. And he'd won the election with less than 40% of the vote, a very small vote, the second smallest vote in our history. So I know he's famous and he's on the penny and the $5 bill, and we all love the Lincoln Memorial and we all love him. But it is amazing to consider how weak he was after winning. He had a very small percentage of the vote. Half the country hated him. Even where he was a little more popular, he was not universally liked. And he had such big problems to solve, and it is a miracle that he solved them all.
Did this trip, evading assassins, giving public speeches, did that sway people? But by the time these 13 days were up, were more people on his side than before he got on the train?
That's a good question, and I believe the answer is yes, that he was exciting to people. So, I mean, you can decide you're going to campaign. It doesn't mean it's going to go well, but with him, it did go well. He was a natural, and that was a very new thing. So nobody quite knew what campaigning meant, and he was good at just being out there in front of the people. He did it all day long. In a small whistle stop, he'd go say something. In a big city, he'd say something. But he was also letting out his documents, his written speeches, his short statements. He would get them out to the press through the telegraph, which was already a very powerful, not so different from what the internet is now. He could say something, and one of his aides could type it up, and they could make a telegram and get it around the whole country very quickly. So he was a sophisticated, I mean, he looked like a bit of a rube, and yet he was turning into an extremely shrewd politician. And yes, he won over a lot of Americans. And I mean, I'm interested in the political tactics, but also a lot of it was just the man himself. The man was not afraid to go out and stand in front of thousands of people and shake their hands and say a word to someone as they walked by. And I think that may have saved democracy as much as any big speech with beautiful language. I think it might have just been the man putting himself out there for the people.
We had a talk last week. Somebody was talking about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Well, his first VP was Hannibal Hamlin, who's from Maine. If something had happened to Lincoln, what would have been Hamlin's position on the South?
Well, you've asked a question that's very dear to my heart, Mark, because the only claim to fame inside my family is I am the great great grandson of the first cousin of Hannibal Hamlin. So not quite of him, but of his first cousin. I know it's pretty remote, but you know, you take what you get. So anyway, we had a little cult of Hannibal Hamlin in my household, and we're like, if only he had not been removed as vice president. But what would have happened, I don't know. He was from Maine. He was a former member of the Democratic Party, which I think would have been good because Southerners were mainly Democrats, so he might have been able to relate to them. Lincoln is a Republican and a former Whig. He'd become pretty anti-slavery, and that might have been hard for him because Lincoln was very good at seeming conciliatory even when he's making big things happen. And Hamlin might have been a little more like a New Englander. He might have just said, slavery has to end and called attention to it. And Lincoln might have been a better politician, actually. But as it was, he was removed. And, you know, there's still a bit of a mystery in my family as well as in the history books. Why did it happen? And Lincoln was sort of hands-off and claimed not to have anything to do with it, but it's a little hard to believe that he would have let such a big decision go by without consenting to it. I mean, I think there was a feeling as the war was going better in 1864 that it would not be a bad thing to have a Southerner as VP, so Andrew Johnson fit the bill, but he didn't really fit the bill in terms of his personal qualifications. He was not a very good politician, and as it turned out, you know, just had terrible relations with Congress and with a lot of people, and had a problem with alcohol, and so he wasn't up to the huge task of succeeding Lincoln. And I'm not sure Hamlin would have been either. I'm not sure anyone would have been, but I think Hamlin was probably a little bit more used to Washington and a little bit smoother at getting legislation through, and probably would have been a little bit easier.
Did Lincoln's family travel with them on his trip? And
They did. They missed the first day, but they met him the second day in Indianapolis, and they are part of the fun. I mean, the trip is both scary and fun. And he's got 3 sons. One is an older teenager, Robert Todd Lincoln, who is having the time of his life. He's going out probably drinking with friends every night. And there's a funny scene where Lincoln gives him a little briefcase with his inaugural address inside of it. It's the most important speech he's ever given. And Robert Todd Lincoln is in such a hurry to go out with his friends that he just gives it to a hotel clerk and says, can you stash this somewhere? And then he comes in and Lincoln says, where's my speech? And he says, oh, I don't know, I gave it to some hotel clerk. And Lincoln goes crazy and runs downstairs and jumps over the bar between where the crowd is supposed to stand in the closet where they store bags. And he starts opening every bag to find his speech. And finally, he finds it. But that would have been a disaster if he'd lost speech. And he's got his two younger sons, Tad and Willie, and they're a lot of fun. They're like young, mischievous scamps, and they're fun for Lincoln on the trip, and they're fun for the reporters who are trying to get near to Lincoln. I mean, he's got his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, who was frankly a bit of a challenge for me because you feel, I felt a little bit of her, some of her difficult pressures on him. She loves to be given a luxurious gift. And if someone gives her one, then she wants to do a favor for the person who gave it to her, which is extremely awkward for her husband, who does not want to be doing favors for anybody. But I think they also really loved each other, and they're a family traveling on the train together, and she's the mom of his kids. And so I think it's a little simplistic to say she's just difficult. I think she's both difficult and he loves her, and he's trying to keep her happy.
We have a question here. Is it true during his farewell speech in Springfield that he did not expect to return to Springfield?
I believe that is true. I derived that belief from reading in some writings, primarily by his law partner, William Herndon, who's a phenomenal source about Lincoln. He was his business partner, but he also was his biographer, and he wrote down things about this unusual man, even while they were practicing law, and then when he became president, and then after he was killed, Herndon sends out hundreds of letters to people who might have known Lincoln and gathers in all this material. It's very important. And he wrote that he thought Lincoln knew that he was not coming back. I don't think anyone knew it with certainty. I mean, I just think he had a feeling of doom in his bones, that he knew he was going somewhere very, very hard, and that he was, in a sense, sacrificing himself for his country. I think it was something like that, and there are glimmers of that in that farewell speech. His lip is trembling, and everyone was on the verge of tears, and I think there was just a strong feeling in this pretty small town that a beloved citizen of Springfield was going away and was not coming back.
You mentioned source material, and at the top of your talk, you said this took, you're reading newspapers, it took you 9 years. Take us through the process. What newspapers did you read? How long, what was a good source for you? Where'd you find all this stuff?
Well, that's a great question. I did 13 articles about 13 days in 13 days. So I did an article a day in February 2011 for the New York Times. And you could say I was already like 3/4 done after 13 days. And then it took me 9 more years. So what happened, part of it was life. I had to go do some jobs in other places, and that, that just took me away from it. But I really read a lot. I wanted to read deeply in the Lincoln biographies, and there are so many of them. But I did try to read dozens of them. I won't say hundreds, but dozens. There actually are thousands. There are reported to be 15,000 biographies or books about Abraham Lincoln. A really good stage for me was reading local newspapers along the trip. I don't even think that would have been possible 20 or 30 years ago, unless you went to every local. I mean, you guys are a local, a library and a historical society, and I would have had to go to hundreds of places along the route to find any shred of evidence from 1861 describing Lincoln. But now, because of, one database in particular, there's something called Chronicling America that was built by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Library of Congress. And it's a free database. And you go to their website and they say, what do you want to look, what newspaper do you want to read? And you list it by state, and then you list it by year. And with some states like New York, you're still going to get quite a few newspapers, but you can narrow it down pretty quickly. And when you just say 1 year, it limits it a lot. And then they all come up, every page of every newspaper comes up. So it's an incredible, generous source for free. I mean, I worry sometimes about some databases, you have to pay money to enter, or you have to be part of a university rich enough that it has subscribed. And Mark mentioned that I'm still affiliated with Brown, and because I am, I can usually get those paid databases for free. I also now teach at a poor university, the City University of New York, and their library doesn't have any of these rich subscriptions. So there's a kind of split screen in American research where if you don't have a special privilege, it's that much harder to do the research. And I'm worried about that. But that's one reason I love Chronicling America, is it's paid for by the NEH and it's free to everyone. And the NEH sometimes gets bad press, but they do really great work, and they make it possible for historians to go do the work of their own.
You mentioned on the route on the trip, he goes to Albany, he goes to New York City. They're obviously near New England. What's the reception as he's getting in close to this area code? What, it's more abolitionist here, or did they look upon him as that he was one of us kind of thing, or how was he viewed?
I think one of his big challenges, he's been elected as the first Republican, but nobody quite knows what the Republican Party is because it's so new. So if you're in Massachusetts, there's a pretty good chance you are an abolitionist, that you've joined this new party because you think slavery is profoundly wrong and you want to see the country turn around and be more moralistic. And there's nothing to be ashamed of with that position. It's a very good position. In huge other stretches of the country, like Indiana and Illinois, where he's from, and Pennsylvania, to be a Republican isn't nearly as abolitionist as it is in Massachusetts. It's more like jobs and schooling and kind of services and services for people moving out west, people moving to a place like Illinois. How can they get a loan? How can they get a little piece of land to farm and start a new life that includes immigrants? And slavery is a little bit uncomfortable with some of those people. They're not as angry about it as they are in Massachusetts. So Lincoln has to bridge that divide, and he does it very well. He's a little conservative for the people in New England. He's plenty anti-slavery for a lot of the people in the Midwest, and the South thinks he's like a rabid anti-slavery demagogue, which of course he isn't. He's a very careful politician, but he really is pretty close to the center of where American opinion is. And that's why he beat William Henry Seward, who was a more famous politician. He's a very important senator from New York, former governor of New York, and he was a step more abolitionist than Lincoln. He was a little bit more like the New Englanders. And as a result, he was that much less popular in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Indiana. And it's funny, in 2020, we're still deciding presidential elections in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin. And Lincoln was strong in those places.
One of the things you mentioned at the top of your talk was the 2020, what's going on right now around us as we're all sitting here. As the different issues come across our desk, it's also what was coming across his desk at 140 years ago, 160 years ago. How does Lincoln stand up in time? Most historians would put him as number one or two. How's he rank for you? How does he stand up over the test of time?
He's number one for me. I mean, we're all really thinking about this, and George Washington is often number two for most people, and he might be for me, although I think his greatness is more as a general winning a very difficult war for independence. But he's also an important president, yet he's part of this, reevaluation right now that's very difficult. I like Franklin Roosevelt a lot too, and I still admire John F. Kennedy. I don't know if I'd put him in the top 3, but I'd put him in the top 10. I was born in Boston, so I grew up partly in Massachusetts, and but Lincoln, I think, is number one by a fair amount, because he not only survives. He leads a very difficult military struggle and wins. So really only 3 people have done that: FDR, Lincoln, and George Washington. And only 2 did it while president: FDR and Lincoln. But then he also manages things politically very well and builds up Northern support from the people. Even when politicians don't always love him, he's building up support from the people. He wins a difficult re-election in 1864. FDR did that too. He won re-election 3 times, once during World War II. But then there's this mystery of where did he come up with the beautiful words that do so much to define our country, even 155 years later. I don't think anyone has ever spoken more beautifully about what it means to be American, and that was a surprise. Lincoln is really pretty obscure when he wins, and then he's got all these headaches to get through on the train trip that I wrote about, and then he makes it, and then he's president, and then this beautiful language starts to come out of him, and there are glimpses of it on the train trip. I was very happy about that. I thought there were signs. It's almost like a butterfly coming out of a caterpillar, that there are signs that something special is happening. But then 2 years later, you get the Gettysburg Address, and then 2 years after that, the second inaugural, and it's just, he could go somewhere very deep. And all of our presidents have been impressive men, and they triumphed over incredible odds to win election. But that doesn't bring the golden oratory, and only Lincoln has it to that degree.
We had someone a couple years ago that was talking about Lincoln, and you said you got to remember something for somebody who won 2 elections narrowly. He had a tough time in 1860. He had a tough re-election fight in 1864, and yet he's assassinated on Easter weekend. He's shot on a Good Friday. He dies on Saturday, and here it's Easter Sunday. And for a lot of Northerners, that was really when he became number one in their eyes. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, it was mind-boggling in every way. No president had been assassinated, so it was shocking. The way he was shot from behind was tragic. It wasn't like a duel. It was like a cowardly way to sneak up and kill someone. He had no chance to defend himself. He wins. He is assassinated 6 days after the surrender of Robert E. Lee. So that was mind-boggling, that he shot in the moment of his greatest triumph. And who knows, he might have had pretty difficult times in Reconstruction over the next year or two that might have diminished his reputation somewhat. And then what you mentioned, it was on Good Friday, and this was a very religious country. It was still a very Protestant country, but there were large numbers of Irish Catholics coming in from Ireland and Germany, other places. And it was just, the Bible was, it was separate from our politics and our free public education system. But people read the Bible all the time. There were Bibles in almost every house, and people went to church in huge numbers. And so for this humble man to be cut down on Good Friday was a shocking coincidence. And it's interesting to read a lot of ministers in their Sunday services after that Friday when he was shot. They all talked about Jesus, and it really struck a chord.
All right, we have one more question here, and it was is after he takes the oath of office, but Fort Sumter's attacked. The war starts. Was it his decision alone to protect it? Did he have Congress's backing? How, when things transpire, and did he see it? Was he expecting this? Was it a surprise? Obviously, he becomes a wartime president at that juncture. So
yeah, good question. Well, he knows he's got a problem at Fort Sumter because it's been a problem for James Buchanan also. There are two forts in the harbor of Charleston. One is called Fort Moultrie, and the other is Fort Sumter. And a Northern officer, Robert Anderson, in late December, pulls all of his troops out of Fort Moultrie, which isn't as good a fort, and moves them over to Fort Sumter. And that enrages the South. And it's funny that it enrages them because it's actually a really good military move, but they just were expecting a surrender. And so the fact that he moves to this better fort really angered them. And there were a couple moments, even when Buchanan is president, where they might have attacked, but they didn't. And then Lincoln comes in, and I don't think he had a plan right away. I mean, it's interesting to see Lincoln not being perfect, because he seems so perfect so often. And I don't think he really knew what to do. That was a big problem. He didn't want to start a war, but he had US troops occupying a US fort in the United States. It was in South Carolina, and just because they had seceded didn't mean he had to agree that they had seceded, and he never did. He said it was all illegal, that the US was the US. So it's a US fort with US soldiers, and he just wants to give them food so they don't starve. And that was the act that precipitated the Civil War. You asked if he checked with Congress. I don't think he did very much. I think they may not even have been in session at that moment. But I think he was largely acting on his own authority. His cabinet, and William Seward especially, is a former member of Congress, so I think he's probably doing the right thing and letting people know. But I think Lincoln was probably acting on his own. And as we now know, it was a brilliant tactical move because it forced the South Carolinians to open fire on a ship that presented no military threat. It was just bringing food and provisions into a US fort.
one last question before we let you go. You said 15,000 books have been written about Lincoln. Why does he continue to fascinate? And what, while you were doing your research, what did you learn about him that you didn't know prior to researching and getting ready to write?
That's a great question. I became more interested in his moodiness. I read a lot of accounts from, I mentioned his law partner, William Herndon, and others who said he projected a kind of strange feeling to people. He you could walk in on him and he might not know you were there, and he would look like the saddest man on earth. There was some profound sadness inside of him that everyone commented on. But he could then control it and get out of it and say something funny and crack up the room and crack up himself. And I think his quick wit was a kind of strategy for dealing with some very deep sadness inside of him. He'd lost his mother when he was young. He lost his sister. He lost a woman he loved in New Salem, Illinois, and Rutledge. Maybe that was it, or maybe it was just something deep inside of him. But it's unusual for a president to be that sad. And I think we maybe unconsciously feel that even when we look at the photographs. He's an odd-looking man. And I think we feel, we say honesty. We call him Honest Abe Lincoln, but we also feel that here is a suffering, authentic human being that we can relate to. He's not just all about himself. He's not a slick politician. He's strange in many ways. And I think the same thing we feel as people who look at his photographs. I remember feeling that as a kid. I was like, I'm drawn to this unusual looking face. I think people seeing him go by on the train felt the same way, built sympathy from them because he was authentic and he's in pain and he was incredibly brave and he knew he was doing something really difficult to save America, not only for living Americans, but for us, for future Americans. And he said that a few times too. So.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for doing this. I want you to stay safe up there in Maine. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Again, stay safe out there. Again, his book is 13 Days to Washington, and it's available at 8 Cousins. Dr. Widmer, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. We've got another talk tomorrow night. Hope you're there. Stay safe, everyone.
Thanks, Mark. I really enjoyed it. Love Falmouth.